All right. So, welcome to another episode of Mormon Discussion Podcast. I'm sitting here with Anthony Miller. Anthony, say hi to everybody.
Hello, everyone.
So, glad you're able to join me this time. I did an episode about a week ago on COVID-19, talking about kind of where things were at, just putting kind of a post-Mormon face to the conversation and trying to point people towards some resources and things. This seems like a really serious moment in our history, Anthony. And I'm just curious maybe how before we get into some of the news and some of the ways that this has affected the church and how they've handled it, just thoughts on how you and your family are dealing with being socially distancing as well as dealing with a pandemic.
Well, I'm a financial advisor and have been for about 29 years. And so, after I started in the business, Japan went through a significant decline. Remember Japan, you're probably old enough to remember when Japan was going to take over the world and they were buying everything up and so forth. And then their economy just they had a financial crisis and a collapse in the early 90s. And I had clients when the dot-com bubble crashed and September 11th happened. And, I held their hands through, metaphorically and physically, through the recession that happened thereafter. And then we recovered. And then I had clients during the financial crisis too. And we prepared for those kinds of things. We had money in reserves and planned to not have to sell during a panic and made sure people's needs were taken care of during the financial crisis. And so to a certain extent, what we're currently going through feels like old hat because I've walked clients through these things before. And to the extent that clients followed my advice, they're going to be fine, even if we have a very, very severe recession, even if it takes 2-3 years for these kinds of things to recover. On the other end of the spectrum, though, this is very, very different. Like, this is so unprecedented. Maybe people who were around during the Spanish flu time, or maybe people who were around during World War II, they could begin to have some sense of what we're dealing with right now. But this is very, very different. And it's very scary because a lot of people don't know where to find accurate information. And a lot of the information out there is driven out of fear and conspiracy. And it's just a very, very interesting time that we're in. I'm an extrovert, and I've been working from home since March 20th because most of my clients are seniors. And we're a backup caregiver for a family member who's in an assisted living facility. If they have to close down that facility due to an outbreak, we would need to be able to go be caregiver for that person. And so my wife and I need to be very, very careful. And so it's just a very, very interesting time that we're in.
Yeah, I'm 41 years old, and I've never seen our country change our daily life this much. And I know it's happened before. We can go far back to the Spanish flu, which was really similar. We can look at the wars that we've been in. We can look at different things that this country's had to encounter. But this has been a different animal for somebody born, I was born in 1978, somebody born in that time. And after, and again, I know you're talking about having dealt with some of the ramifications of recession. I really didn't. And there was a 2008 recession, but it really didn't affect me. I worked for a company, and we kept plugging along and really didn't have really bad years. So just lucky. And here I am in this moment, then trying to kind of make sense of it. So appreciate your 2 cents. Maybe just start us off, maybe just any thoughts you've got on some of the things that are in the news out there, some of the things that you're thinking about in the past, say, 7 days with this virus and how we are all negotiating with it.
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of interesting dynamics take to root. For example, we've had a period of quite a few years where there's an increasing distrust of science. And so if scientists come out and talk about global warming, or if they talk about something like this virus or something, there's a general mistrust with a lot of people, where they're willing to seek alternative sources of information because they have this distrust for science and so forth. And it's interesting. There seems to be an important and significant effect of people not understanding math really, and understanding what exponential growth means. You know, for something to grow 20-30% per day and double every 3-4 days, that's crazy. And a lot of people, they're trying to equate static numbers with exponential numbers, and that just doesn't work. So that's been very, very interesting to see. Also, there's this very, very different dynamic in that the experience, we can kind of see what's coming in heavily populated areas in the US because we see what's happened in other countries. And we also can potentially see the effects of shutdowns, quarantines, and so forth. We can see what South Korea did that was helpful. And places that are very rural, like North Dakota, they have a very different situation because it's a very rural place. They're several weeks behind everyone else in the infection rate. And the kind of things that we'll talk about today during the next hour will probably be in place to help them long before they are in a similar problematic situation that, for example, New York finds itself in. So it's just very, very interesting dynamic that we see all over the place. And politics are in it. You know, whether you like Trump or you hate Trump or you're ambivalent about Trump, like there's some very interesting things in terms of his reaction to things, where he was like bragging that his viewership of his press conferences was more than The Bachelor and so forth, making it, I mean, it's showing the degree of narcissism that he operates with. And I think all presidents are probably narcissists by their, you know, otherwise why would you run for president? But some of those things are kind of showing too.
Yeah, as I've sat and I pulled the map up here, and this was this morning, this isn't even up to date and current. Things that catch my eye, so China hasn't had a new case in weeks, right? So it's this idea that there are certain places where the numbers are skewed and they're not really being reported accurately. This was off the Drudge Report. This map, by the way, and for those who don't trust the Drudge Report, that's fine. This map is a sick map put together by Johns Hopkins University. I think extremely reliable, outside of the fact that some countries aren't reporting accurately their data. And so you see China, I think they were at 82,000. I think they were at 82,000 a week ago. It's interesting to watch how they want to pretend as if they're giving accurate numbers, but really doesn't seem to be. North Korea is another one. I think they've said they haven't had one single case yet, which is just impossible. So on top of that, you look at the US and we've got, you know, more than twice as many cases now as any other country that is reporting accurately. And that to me is startling. Like I'm deeply hurt and bothered by the fact that we as a country, the United States of America, that we didn't prepare better and handle this better in a way as to slow this down quicker before it got to this point. Another thing that came up, I'll pull it up here. The Surgeon General of the United States of America just said, I believe yesterday, that this is going to be one of the hardest weeks in our history, that we're going to see a ton of death. And as I hear some of the stories coming out about the major, and again, this really isn't an issue for rural or even suburban places quite yet in terms of being overwhelmed in their medical staff. But in the major cities, you have at this point a real issue with running out of supplies, PPEs, which we've all heard that term. I love when world events happen and new words and acronyms enter our vocabulary. PPEs, ventilators, ICU beds. But the Surgeon General says essentially prepare for this generation's Pearl Harbor, prepare for this generation's 9/11 moment. I think we're going to see this the next 2 weeks. It's going to be an immense amount of death for a group of us in certain age brackets that have never seen this amount of death before.
Yeah, there's I shared it on my Facebook timeline. this week. There's a health institute that's part of the University of Washington Medical School that is running modeling on use of resources, when peak deaths would be, need for ventilators, need for ICU beds, need for hospital beds, and so forth, taking into consideration what each state has in terms of restriction of movement, social distancing, travel, shutdowns, things like that. And their estimate is that we'll see peak U.S. new daily or peak U.S. use of resources about 10 days from now, and that we'll see peak deaths about 11 days from now. So the next 10, 11 days, according to their study, is going to be pretty significant. I also question as well, and I think once we have more massive antibody testing that we planned on talking about, is there's probably a lot of people that have had it and recovered and not realized it really. And so the actual numbers of infection in the U.S. are probably higher than what Johns Hopkins is showing. That doesn't diminish the resource use and the deaths and so forth, but it does grow exponentially. The big thing with numbers and why we're supposed to pay attention in math is and understand exponential numbers is that numbers can grow exponentially and they can decline exponentially too. So if on average one infected person infects 3 people every day that they're contagious, that is of significant exponential growth. Or if one person just in the total life cycle of their infection infects 3 people, that also provides exponential growth. But if you can reduce that to one person infecting 0.3 people, then that creates an exponential decline in infections as well. And so that's really what we're shooting for, is doing what we need to do so that for every one infected person infects less than 1 person. And the lower that number is, the more exponential the decline in infection will be, so that people who are conspiracy theorists can say that we overreacted. And hopefully that's what comes out of this, is this idea that we overreacted, but we had to in order to have exponential decline in infection rates.
Yeah, Italy just announced that they began to experience a decrease in new cases. And so you see them, where they're at in that curve, in that trajectory. I think, if I'm not mistaken, we're at least about 3 weeks ahead of or behind them. And so as we've done whatever we've done here, and we can debate the measures that each country or even each state in the United States has taken, our country has set ourselves up to really push this thing at a rate that's, I think, faster than other places. I know populations of various countries are different, but some of these countries don't have that much of a significant difference from our population, maybe 20% less, and yet their numbers are half as much. I'm really nervous about how we did this thing and what it's going to look like, as you point out, in 11 days, when there literally will be no debate. There literally will be, in major metro areas, there will be the decision made on who gets the ventilator and who doesn't, who gets to lay in a bed and who doesn't. And man, I can't even imagine being in that space. I've got COPD, Anthony. I'm scared to death of getting this thing. The death rate here, if people get treated, is somewhere between about 1.4 and 3.4%. But for people who have ailments, there's a much more serious risk. For those who we know contracted the 19 virus, as well as we know that they have, for instance, COPD, the death rate for COPD is about 9.3%. So about 1 out of every 10 people. And I think you're right. I think there's a lot of people who got this who didn't have symptoms, or symptoms were so mild that they're not part of this collected data. And there may be people who early on had this and had it harsh, but just didn't even know what it was yet, because the virus hadn't made its way to this country. So that wasn't even a thought, in the ether at that point. But, we're all trying to make decisions about whether we flatten this curve and make a recession, go even longer, whether we take more financial hardship, or whether we just like bear the brunt of it now. And there are pros and cons to both those decisions. I don't want to dismiss the other side of the argument, but we're talking about human lives. And again, I also want to say there are human lives on the other side of this too. If we just flatten this curve for 2-3 years, then we deal with the social consequences as well. Depression, suicide, things like that do go up in those situations also, as well as in a financial crisis. People tend to be more depressed and some end up taking their life. So there isn't a perfect answer. There's no win-win here. But the debate of how we lengthen this or shorten this and the pros and cons of each is a conundrum that I'm glad I'm not the decision maker in.
Yeah, I mean, in wartime, there was a podcast, a Radio Lab podcast episode that I shared on my Facebook timeline also. The title was Playing God. And it's a very interesting story of what happened in a hospital in New Orleans after Katrina, and them running out of resources and having to decide, basically do triage and decide who's going to die and who isn't going to die. And having trying to develop some sort of framework or measuring system to objectively decide who's going to die and who isn't. And that's what happens when you run out of resources. And if we have sufficient resources, we can reduce the frequency of death. But like in Italy, where they've run out of resources, then it's just a very, very bad thing.
Yeah, the Spanish flu, I think about 20% of people who contracted it died. If we were to run completely out of medical supplies, all the ventilators are taken, all the ICU beds are taken, the mortality rate from this goes up certainly somewhat, at least statistically significant, 6, 7, maybe 8%, 9%, somewhere in there. In terms of, you mentioned just a few minutes ago, you talked about the plasma antibodies. That was one of the things we wanted to cover tonight. Talk for a moment about what you're hearing about that.
Yeah, so I'll set it up. It's a little bit complicated. So South Korea showed us a model of stopping exponential growth. So South Korea, is close to China. They saw what was going on. So they started doing massive testing right from the beginning. They had their general population wear masks, not to protect the mask wearer from other people, but to protect other people from the mask wearer, basically. They did massive testing. They quarantined people who tested positive. They isolated people who were vulnerable or high-risk situations. And so instead of one person infecting 2 or 3, they flattened that curve, so they didn't experience the exponential growth. And they used a kind of test called a PCR test. And what a PCR test is, from a financial advisor who is not a medical MD or anything like that, what a PCR, an RT-PCR test is what they do is they take a sample either from your throat or now from your nasal cavity, and they culture what comes out of that and try to grow what you have in order to be able to identify whether you have active virus in you. And it takes a time to culture that, to send it to a lab, to do the test and so forth. And the reliability of the test is not super high. On the PCR tests, only about, if the sensitivity of the test is only 60 to 70%. And so if you test negative, there's probably still a 30% chance that you might have it if you have symptoms on that test. And the reason that using that test, what they would do is when you recovered or you had symptoms that went away, they wanted you to have 2 consecutive negative tests at least 24 hours apart. And the reason for that is because the test isn't that reliable. It's only a 60 to 70% sensitivity. And it takes time and so forth. So South Korea showed massive testing, mask wearing, quarantining the infected, isolating the vulnerable populations, that helped. And so they didn't experience the same kind of shutdown that we had to have here in order to slow the exponential growth. The other kind of test,
I want to stop there for just a second, which is,
yeah,
we wanted, in our words, our rhetoric, we wanted to keep the economy moving. We didn't want to shut things down. But on the other side of it, we also didn't want to take those steps necessary that allowed us to continue to some degree business as usual. And that seems to be so strange. Like, we're Americans. We're not going to put on masks. We're not going to socially distance properly. We're Americans. We're free. We're not going to give that up. And then what happens is our economy stalls. Stock market essentially, crashes to some degree. We end up with everybody now unemployment rate and new filings happening. Yet, had we taken those same kinds of steps and taken this seriously, to some degree, we could have kept going business as usual.
Yeah, so there's this saying that's attributed to Winston Churchill, and who knows, maybe it might be like church history, whether or not somebody said something or not. But the saying is that we can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the alternatives. And I think in this circumstance, the Americans, if they didn't perceive the degree of threat, they would have seen it as an intrusion of their privacy and liberty to all of a sudden have the government require massive testing and quarantine and isolation of the vulnerable. But that would have been less intrusive than what's happening today. And so, unfortunately, possibly a byproduct of our culture, possibly it's our leadership, maybe it's a combination of all things. I think it's very, on the spectrum, it's very complicated. But we would have been in a way better place if we would have developed the capacity to follow South Korea's model and do massive testing. But the degree of compliance of Americans, I don't know if it would have been the same as in South Korea. And South Korea, I think there's another dynamic that we're not talking about here, and that is that South Korea was close to the SARS epidemic. And so they had already gone through one of these, and they had that in their collective memory. So next time something like this happens, I think Americans will be more likely to subject themselves to massive testing and quarantine and so forth quicker, because what's happening now will be in our memory, where we didn't really fully experience that with the SARS or MERS or Ebola.
Yeah, good point. So back to the plasma with antibodies, where are we at with that?
Yeah, so back to the testing. So there's another kind of test, and it's an antibody test. And what they do is when you get the SARS-CoV-2 virus, that's the SARS coronavirus number 2 strain, what your body does is produce antibodies, which is like a protein that ends up blocking or connecting into the virus so that it can't attach to the cell and then duplicate its RNA. And what the antibody test does is it looks for immunoglobulins in your system, that there are these protein strains. And it's a fairly quick and basic turnaround time to collect blood to test for these proteins, these antibodies, whether they are a class of antibodies where you have a recent exposure to this virus, or there's a type of antibody, and there's an IgM antibody that if you have a recent exposure, and then there's an IgG antibody that shows if you've developed basically immunity and you've had it a long time ago. And there's a capacity to do a very quick, very inexpensive turnaround time test to test for antibodies. And so going back to the South Korea example, where the PCR tests take a long time for turnaround time, the antibody tests are very quick. Abbott Labs has come out with a device in a system that will test in 5 minutes. Maybe it's 10 or 30 minutes, but it's a fairly quick turnaround time. at a very inexpensive per test, like maybe $1 a test kind of thing. And there are more than 30 companies that have submitted these antibody tests to the FDA, and already there's more than a couple that have been approved by the FDA. And so hopefully during this period of shutdown, we're ramping up capacity to do testing. So that's the first thing with the antibody tests, is that it's this solution that if we have a shutdown, if we can bend the curve, if we can hit our peak numbers in 10, 11 days and have an exponential decline in new infections over time, then that at the same time, if we can develop our capacity for massive testing, then we can follow the South Korea model going forward, number one. So that's very, very hopeful. But the second thing with the antibody tests is antibodies are different than vaccines. So what a vaccine does is inject you with a weak virus, basically, so that you quickly become immune to it. You develop your own antibodies and you become immune to something like measles or something like that. With this plasma antibody type of treatment, what they do is they take blood from people who have had SARS-CoV-2 or traversed COVID-19, who have developed antibodies, and they'll take blood and then they'll separate out the plasma from that blood, and they'll test it to make sure it's clean and that there's not HIV or other viruses in it and so forth. And then that plasma, what they'll do is they'll, and this kind of treatment has been around for more than 100 years. This is how they used to treat measles and other kinds of illnesses before we developed vaccines. So they'll take the plasma and they'll do a plasma infusion into someone. And instead of immediately having immunity, what this does is it injects antibodies into your system as a helper. It helps you to kick the virus's butt, basically, and helps you develop immunity. And it's very promising. The FDA is looking at multiple clinical trials right now before it approves it. But right now, it is approved as convalescent type of care, kind of like these other off-script. There's 69 off-script uses of different drugs like chloroquine that has been talked about and so forth, that the FDA has said, well, you can try to use these things, but we need clinical trials before we actually approve them. And they're looking at that the same way with this plasma treatment, and it's very promising. There are a few problems. First of all is you got to have enough who have traversed the disease to collect enough plasma to inject it into your system, to the people who haven't been exposed, number one. And there's a question of, if you don't get exposed, in over a period of time, 3, 6, 12 months or so forth, does that help you develop immunity if you get the antibodies and you don't get exposed? So there is some question on that, whereas vaccines give you very long-term immunity, and then sometimes they do boosters. Where the home run would be is if we could develop synthetic antibodies. So if we could take plasma, if scientists could genetically reproduce these proteins, these antibodies, and be able to produce them on a large scale, so that you don't have, one person once a week going and giving blood and having a bottleneck of having enough people who are walking around with the antibodies. So that's what's going on with the antibody testing. Again, if we have a shutdown for 4 or 6 weeks or so, or 8 weeks, that gives us time not only to reduce the exponential growth and start to have exponential declines in new infections, but it gives us time to ramp up these things like antibody testing and looking at these off-script uses of drugs like chloroquine and so forth.
Yeah. So the testing, some of the tests started. I know that they've in New York City, I forget what the name of the hospital was, but one of the main hospitals in New York has gotten permission to move forward with trying to get recovered folks antibodies in their plasma, and then start to transfuse that to the folks who need it most, either those who are high risk and have been in contact with the COVID-19 virus, or those who are already showing severe symptoms, in hopes that it would start to help them recover faster, more quickly, to diminish those symptoms in a very short time. So that's kind of what's going on. It's, again, I think none of us really know exactly what this looks like. There are a lot of different graphs out there. There's a lot of different people trying to make an attempt by looking at the data and trying to figure out kind of when our curve starts to turn. What is the peak of it? What are the max deaths? All I know is that the medical personnel in these metro areas you can just see in the interviews where they're talking, they're exhausted. They are struggling to find a mask that protect them. They're struggling to find access to tools and resources to help their patients. And it's just scary. And all that going on with COVID-19. And then tonight we wanted to kind of tie in a little bit with the church. And I'll tell you, just me on the front end of this, I know we're going to talk a little bit about conference. On the front end of this, I saw a church that I used to love and I used to be a member of and be all in and serve faithfully. And I see this church, when this first started to happen, it used this moment in what I would consider an unethical way. People were asked to stay at home so as not to spread it. And what does the church do? It sees a prime moment to send its missionaries out to go door to door, because people are home and they're scared. And both of those two factors make a better space for an open heart to hear the message of the restored gospel. And yet what the church did was it sent out thousands and thousands of potential virus carriers. And not that all of them were infected, and not that many of them were infected, but we know that a few were. And they went door to door and tried to share the gospel with people. And a lot of times it's older people who tend to let people in. They're more lonely. They've already lost a primary partner. They're already in a space where they could use some company and want somebody to socially connect with. And those are the people that are most at risk. I saw the church do that. Then it tried to get its missionaries home late. And I know that there are still missionaries that I talked to one father on Friday whose son was still serving in London, England. And there was no plan to bring that child immediately home. And so there are people out there who are on missions. There are people out there whose children are still on missions in places that is now really difficult to get home in this moment. And maybe for the child's safety or the young adult's safety, depending, I guess we've got 18-year-olds going out, so we'll say adults. But you and I both know, like, it's so hard to make mature adult decisions when this to do. And so these young adults are pressured into being out there, and it's hard to come home, and maybe it's safer for them to stay. But I'm nervous about parents not having their children home where they can be with them in this hard moment. And there are going to be some parents who die from this, or maybe a missionary here or there who dies from this. And they're going to be away from their family and be away from their child when this all happens. And so I saw the church do that. And then I see the church try to get them home. And then I see the church telling its missionary to quarantine themselves for 2 weeks. And so now it's on the right side of things in terms of what it's saying, but it seemed like it really wanted to play it both ways early on. Your thoughts on how it handled the missionary situation, this church that's supposed to have, again, prophets, seers, and revelators, and it seemed like it didn't understand the magnitude of this until it was almost too late.
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is, to a certain extent, leadership roulette. So, for example, not dealing with the mission, but just dealing with the general membership. In our stake, one of our stake presidency members is a physician with a local hospital, has management experience, and so forth. And multiple of the bishops in our 3 local stakes are physicians also. So in our stake, we totally were on top of this right away, and how sacrament meeting is dealt with, or how partaking of the sacrament is dealt with, ministering visits, things like that. Like, our stake totally jumped on it because we had leadership that understood what was going on. But in other places where there are people who, believe that a priesthood blessing could protect them or something like that, they had a totally different experience. And, I've heard and read of some of my friends at different parts of the country where groups were getting together as large as 20 or 30 to have a home sacrament meeting together kind of thing, where in our stake, that kind of thing was totally shut down from the beginning. And so with regard, I would impute that experience to probably what's happening in the mission field, that there are some mission presidents who either the mission president themselves or their counselors were totally on top of this and told the missionaries, you need to not, go out, you need to not tract, you need to not do those things. And there were probably other mission presidents who didn't do that because they weren't. It happened so fast. And my view is the church has a series of different committees that were put together to try to do modeling and scenarios of what they needed to do. And with something that was growing so exponentially, you can't take 2 weeks to figure out what you're going to do. And so my view on that is, yes, it's very problematic that we had missionaries out tracting. It was very problematic that they kept the temples open even while suspending church services. It was very problematic that they didn't immediately bring missionaries home from overseas who might end up getting stuck there for months, maybe in places that don't have the same resources that we do, maybe having family members in the US pass away. So it's very, very problematic. So, it offers to a certain extent a humanistic view in that, if you were going to have a faithful approach to this, is that passage in the Doctrine and Covenants that it's a slothful servant that has to be commanded in all things, and we need to be anxiously engaged in a good cause, and we need to prepare for these kinds of things. But at the same point, I think it probably does stretch some people who perceive that the prophet foresaw this, and there's this. I mean, the evidence of the prophet seeing this in advance would have been he would have closed the temples in January. He would have brought home the missionaries in January when he could do it less expensive and safer, and he would have taken all sorts of different efforts much, much earlier, as well as had planning and committees of trying to figure out what to do if something like this happened. And it just shows the human side, I think, of the organization and the leadership roulette. That's my take. Utah.
Yeah, so here's a map. Yeah, I got you. I was on mute. Yeah. Here's a map of Utah. I realize there are listeners in Utah. There's listeners not in Utah. I don't mean to give any kind of emphasis to the state of Utah in terms of how it's handling the virus. It's much more suburbs, rural areas. In fact, I live in southern Utah, and there is, to go to Vegas, to go to Colorado, to go to Salt Lake City, you have to drive hours through essentially barren land to get to it. And so southern Utah is very much buffered from the rest of the world in terms of the hustle and bustle of cities, and then also encountering people who are infected from the next city over. But one of the things I'm interested to see, and if I can just be blunt, it's that, as you pointed out, there are Mormons out there who believe that they have access to magical powers in order to thwart this infection. And I'm interested. I'm not excited. I'm not saying that like, oh, I can't wait to see this, I'm gonna rub it in. But I'm interested to see that when the data comes out, when this is all done and over with, what the mortality rate is in Utah with COVID-19 in comparison to other areas and states that have a similar demographics to them, similar geography, similar population sparsity, and heavy population areas being similar, along with the juxtaposition of not having access to Mormon priesthood holders. Because I think the average Mormon goes, we Mormons are going to have a lower mortality rate because we have access to God's priesthood and we can give blessings and people can be healed. This is a unique thing Mormonism has. And I know the apologists and defenders of the church will say like, oh, God gives lots of blessings through lots of faith and people can have faith. But if the priesthood doesn't have anything extra special to it, then it's no different than a Catholic Guatemalan mother giving a prayer, or a Seventh-day Adventist doing their ritual, or Jehovah's Witness doing their ritual. So it'll be interesting to see, because I actually expect, due to the arrogance, and I'm using a strong word, the arrogance that comes with groups of people who are on the high demand fundamentalist religion side about their beliefs power to help them, I think, will, compared to the general population, expect a lower mortality rate, expect more miracles, expect God's healing hand to affect them more than others. And when this is all said and done, I also expect the opposite to actually be the data, which is we won't have any advantage in mortality rates. And I actually think that what we actually will find will be a higher mortality rate, because of some of that arrogance of thinking you can survive this no matter how you prep for it. I work in a pawn shop. Customers come in. Again, I'm in southern Utah. About half the population is Mormon. And there are a lot of people coming in and just dismissing this as fake news, dismissing this as not going to bother them, not going to affect them. They keep pointing to God. This is God's punishment on the world. Hence, I'm not going to be punished. I'm on the right side of things. I'm on the in group. And this is God's punishment for places like New York City. One guy actually said that. This is a punishment for all that New York City has done in getting away from God and his word. And I think there's a lot of that in this highly congested Mormon community, as well as this Mormon state. And it's going to be interesting to see how that arrogance plays out, and whether people put themselves at risk more often. And hence the mortality rate is actually higher when all the data comes in, when this thing is over.
Yeah, so we've already seen that in some of the southern evangelical churches, where they use that same narrative, and then a lot of people ended up getting infected. I think what's going to happen with belief dynamics is whatever happens is they're going to perceive that supports their belief, you know. So the dynamics of COVID-19, of this disease, are that it hits men harder than women. It hits people who are obese much harder than people who aren't. It hits smokers harder than non-smokers, vapors harder than non-vapors, and it seems to hit people who live in very pollution-prone areas much harder than people who don't. Probably because of the combination of effects of the ability of the lungs to oxygenize blood, probably related to what happens to your lungs when you smoke or vape or live in a very polluted area, that it's more susceptible to the virus attaching to those ACE cells in the lungs, or the ACE receptors in the cells in the lungs. And so, I don't know. I mean, we'll see. If there are fewer smokers in Utah, then that maybe goes to fewer people needing to be hospitalized. But then there might be more obesity in Utah than other places, which is a negative. And the Wasatch Front has a high degree of pollution, so that's going to affect that too. I think in the end, whatever happens, people will find some faith-affirming view as to how to reconcile what happens. But I agree with you. There'll probably be multiple circumstances that are similar to these evangelical congregations, where they continue to meet because they said God would protect us, and then a bunch of people get infected and some people die.
Yeah. So now moving to this general conference, we were told 6 months ago that this was going to be a conference like any other. And that came true, but President Nelson admits himself that it wasn't for the reasons he thought. He didn't know this was going to happen. I guess your thoughts on what came out of this conference that deals with COVID-19, whether ignoring it, dealing with it, what was said about it, what was missed in being said about it, and where the church dropped the ball or maybe where it hit out of the park.
Yeah, so I was, when President Nelson said that, when he said this was going to be a conference like no other, he said, I could have never foreseen that it was because of COVID-19. And I just thought, good for him, because I had seen so many things on the internet, on social media, in email chains of faithful believing members thinking, proclaiming that this is why we have 2 Hour Church, this is why we have Come Follow Me, this is why we have the $100+ billion, because it was all this prophetic thing. And I just thought, good for President Nelson for squashing that and saying he couldn't have foresaw that. That is not what he was talking about. I thought that was good. My understanding of conference talks is they're prepared a fair amount of time in advance. And so someone who prepared a conference talk in January, they probably didn't prepare it talking about COVID-19 and what would be happening now. So I wouldn't expect a lot of the conference talks to deal with this unless it was someone who either felt comfortable or who had a degree of seniority to feel like they could go off script and change what they had prepared in their talk.
Isn't that a problem, though, Anthony? In that you claim to be a church that has modern revelation that can deal with problems of our day, and yet the very system by which you do this is to prepare things for a time, so that in a crucial moment when things happen in a recent moment, like you didn't have something going on that you're speaking to that's been going on for 4 months, when you're speaking to something that's only been going on for a couple of weeks, you essentially left no space for the speakers collectively to address the very situations that modern revelation, if that's a real thing, what modern revelation really could address.
Yeah, I think it depends on what a person means by revelation and what their expectations are of that. The view or belief of revelation that I had growing up was a Benson McConkie, Hinckley Packer type revelation that was much more literal, and that crumbled on me. And through that lens or paradigm, what's happening today would be pretty difficult. There are other people. It's interesting. I kind of as a diversion, but I think it's relevant. In our local Mormon Spectrum group that we put together, we have some group members who grew up and they were teenagers in the David O. McKay era, and that was a different church then. It was a very, very different church then, and many of them never fully bought into the Joseph Fielding Smith, literalism and the literalism that followed. And that has been an interesting dynamic for them. So they maybe attributed a different meaning to revelation than people who grew up in the church in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And it's possible that some of the kids today are growing up with a different attribution of meaning to revelation, when they deal with things like the policy and then the rollback of the policy and so forth. They're just dealing with it differently. I would say, though, that today I listened to the talks today, and but I didn't get 100% of them. But there was more discussion today about the virus, but we had more members with seniority talking today. We had Elder Holland today. We had Elder Uchtdorf today. And so there was a little bit more discussion of the virus today than there was yesterday. But yeah, it's tough. You just have to, for it to be healthy and sustainable, you just have to redefine what revelation means. It's something
Yeah.
other than you being a scribe for God as he dictates to you in your language, in your native language, word for word what his will is. That's just not sustainable.
Right, right. And lastly, to go off kind of subject, we tried to make this entirely about COVID-19 and the tangents of where it affects the church. But I just want to get, maybe with a few minutes left, that President Nelson seemed to be preparing us for, and I say us because there are parts of me that still say I'm Mormon and this is my tribe, even though now I've left this tribe and found other tribes that are healthier. I still claim this as one of my tribes. And President Nelson sold this general conference as, you're going to want to be there. This is going to be big. This is going to be something you're going to want to prepare for and watch and attend or view or listen to, and marvelous things are going to take place. That was the perception I had when he got us all ready. And what came out of it was a logo, and that could be its own episode, to talk about whether that logo is appropriate, whether that logo is really important in considering all that's going on in the world. And then the other thing was kind of institutionally literalizing, essentially the first discussion, what the church is and what it claims to be and how it came to be, with historical events involving heavenly messengers and literally coming down and putting this work on the path that it went on. And I just wanted to get your thoughts, and I'll share mine first, which is that if I was a believing Mormon still, I had to kind of chuckle today, and I kind of cried a little too, but I kind of had to chuckle today that this is what everybody was supposed to get excited for, and it seemed like there really wasn't anything here. It was the same kind of talks, a little more rigidity to some of them. There were some harsh things said. I know people were pointing to Elder Holland and Elder Oaks and some of the things they said as being hurtful. In terms of Elder Holland teaching that those who aren't on the covenant path won't live with their families again. And I haven't caught up yet with what Elder Oaks said, but I did see some people pointing to his talk as harmful. And yet we get a logo change. We get this proclamation that's kind of an institutional literalizing of the story again. And I didn't really notice, from what I picked up from what people were sharing, anything else that could be considered like, hey, get excited, there's something new coming and on the way. Did you see something that kind of fit what President Nelson was trying to get people geared up for? It felt like a big oversell.
Yeah, so a few things, observations. I would say, based on what we saw, I think probably the plan was to do a solemn assembly with the Hosanna shout, and have some of the talks broadcast from the Sacred Grove or something like that. I think that they were probably looking at that. They were going to introduce the new logo. They were going to have the new proclamation. Now, this is the 6th proclamation that the church has done. And what a proclamation is basically like an executive order. So if you canonize something, you got to have the law of common consent. But if you issue a proclamation, it's more like an executive order. And this is like the 6th one. And if we look back to the 1981 that happened during the sesquicentennial, the 150-year anniversary, it's kind of similar to this one. And so while it's new and it's very doubles down on historicity and actual visitations and literalism, with regard to some things that scholars might think would be a little bit problematic, it's not a whole lot different than the 1980 proclamation that also had some of those elements to it. So I think the proclamation is problematic because as we accept biblical scholarship and we look at history and things like that, this literalism of visitations and so forth, and doubling down on historicity of things is problematic. On the other end of the spectrum, You and I have talked about this 10, 20-year plan, however long it is, to incrementally get to a place of less literalism and to talk more about the canon being revelatory as opposed to a literal translation. And there was a talk about that, talking about the Book of Mormon being a revelation, and changing the name of the church, changing the logo to have Jesus on it, seems to be part of a plan to de-emphasize the Book of Mormon. That's probably not the right word, but to de-emphasize how we represented ourselves to the world in the past and focus more on Jesus. Now, if we could get to the next steps, where in conference talks we heard talks where instead of talking about Jesus, we would actually hear talks that are quoting the Jesus of the Gospels, quoting the parables, and so forth. Like, that would be interesting if Jesus showed up that way. And I think that incrementally interspersed through there are some of those kinds of things. But my hope in the future would be to move more towards Jesus, more towards the Jesus of the Gospels, and instead of talking about Jesus, actually talking, quoting the things that are attributed to him. I think that would be helpful. With regard to the logo, human beings, we tend to perceive God as a mirror of ourselves, or how we would like to perceive ourselves. And so it would make sense that a Western church would, represent a Caucasian, Western, buff Jesus, instead of a Nazarene. And so that makes sense. I don't know if it's helpful to, worldwide church that's growing very fast in Africa, but shrinking in the Western world. If it's helpful to have our logo be Western, Caucasian, buff Jesus as opposed to the Nazarene. But I understand why they did it. And, maybe it's just messy, maybe they're working on getting to where they need to be in the future to be healthier and more sustainable. And this is an attempt at that. But then this proclamation then just goes right back to the doubling down on literalism and historicity. So
yeah, it seems
that's my
like
take
two
on
different
those things.
camps, right? It seems like two different camps came up with these ideas. One camp said we need to impose the literal story, and no matter how problematic these truth claims are, this is what makes us different. This is what makes us interesting. We're going to hold to that. And then on the other hand, you've got somebody saying that, instead of showing Moroni, why don't we show Jesus? Why don't we become a less peculiar people? Why don't we make it harder for people to distinguish Mormonism from any other Christian denomination that's out there? And let's find ways to find commonalities rather than peculiarness. And so it's kind of interesting to watch, because on some level, somebody at the top, President Nelson or the first presidency or whoever, is approving both messages. And so that's happening. I'll tell you, going back to COVID,
I do have one more thing.
Please do.
Yeah. So there were something, it was interesting today how many talks dealt with people who had left or resigned. They talked about people resigning, and then they talked about people coming back, and then there was the reference, unfortunately, Elder Uchtdorf referenced people leaving as like a disgruntled, angry child or something. That wasn't very helpful. But in any event, it was
especially since he's the guy who said that it's not that simple why people leave, and there are a myriad of issues, and that we ought to grant grace to these people, and then to have essentially the message that now labels them or isolates them as having done something inferior to the rest of us.
Yeah. So the light of what happened today, I think I want to share. This is a quote from Elder Holland's talk, and that actually gives me hope for this quote that I'll read. Elder Holland said, "When we have conquered this," talking about the virus, "and we will, may we be equally committed to freeing the world of the virus of hunger. May we free neighborhoods and nations from the virus of poverty. May we hope for schools where students are taught and not terrified they will be shot, and for the gift of personal dignity for every child of God, unmarred by any form of racial, ethnic, or religious prejudice. Like, I can get behind that. You know, if we see their perception of what's happening now as license to use that $100 billion to do the kinds of things that Elder Holland's talking about here, I could get pretty excited about seeing those things happen.
It is interesting that, again, the stock market took a hit. So I'm sure that 124 billion now is 91 billion or 84 billion, or maybe they cashed it out at the right moment and held on to it and going to throw it back in. But they said that money was set aside for a recession, a rainy day fund. It was set aside for hard times. Man, if we don't start using it now, then I have to kind of look at that statement as not really honest. So we're about to enter a recession. We should expect, because they claimed that the church would continue to run as usual, and that money would fund it and keep the church from having to cut back on programs. So now we'll see, because the church, I don't think, saw this coming. It didn't expect to have to put it weeks or months after it said that. And so now it has a prime opportunity to cash out those stocks and bonds and to put that money to good use at a time when we have unprecedented unemployment filings, when we have unprecedented illness and disease for people my age in this country and in other places in the world. It'll be interesting if these guys start spending a little bit. If Elder Holland says, like, we can start to fix hunger, it would be nice if, instead of expecting members to now go above and beyond the 10% they give, that we take this rainy day fund and start to use it for some of this good in the world.
That's my hope. I could get excited about that.
Good. I love how you're always positive, Anthony. I love how I'm sitting here being critical, and you take these softballs that I'm throwing to you, and you're saying, like, no, let's just talk about this a different way and be kind. You're a better human being than me. I'm more polemic than you.
There are definitely problems. Yeah. There are things that were said today that are very unhelpful and decisive, and there were things divisive, and there are things from yesterday that were very, very unhelpful. It almost felt like they were ramping up, with this theme of talks to suggest that maybe women could pass the sacrament, or maybe they could bless their families and their homes, and then for some women that I've talked to and interacted with, it kind of feel like they got the rug pulled out from under them, because they were hoping that was going to be the big thing. So there certainly are problems, but there are there are some things that were helpful. I would have rather, like I said, I'd rather see Jesus as a Nazarene on the logo rather than as a Viking. But I understand why people see it that way too. So.
Yeah. The last thing I wanted to say about the COVID-19, the novel coronavirus. Let me put my screen back up here of the U.S. So I understand the lag in data, and if I go over the total confirmed, these are people dealing with the virus. Now, again, I don't have the update, but it's going to be higher. The 1.2 million people who are currently infected that we know of and dealing with the virus. But if I go over here to the right side of that screen, you have 252, 250,000 people who are total recovered. And then you have the deaths at 66,000. And it caught me off guard, because I keep hearing that this mortality rate's about 1.5% to 3.5%. And I realize in places where they run out of supplies, it's going to be a little higher. But I was quite surprised to see 250,000 recovered and 66,000 deaths. That is, if I'm not mistaken, that's about 25%. that number caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting that. Now I know that as some of the people who are dealing with it right now, as they move over to the side, that percentage will go down a little bit. But I'm beginning to wonder now if the mortality rate really is between 1.5% and 3%, 3.5%, or if something else is going on that makes this mortality rate significant, at least in the people who show serious symptoms and hence get the test and are found to have it. Your thoughts there?
Yeah. So this is part of the math and the exponential growth situation. It takes anywhere from 14 to 37 days to process this. And it's generally believed that it takes 28 to 37 days to be fully immune and not contagious anymore. And when you have something that's doubling every, 3-4 days, and you have, let's say, 28 days on average, you're going to have numbers like this where only a quarter of the people who are confirmed cases, basically people who we tested because they showed strong enough symptoms, only a quarter of them have either died or recovered. And that's just an effect of the exponential growth. I think that we look at this, 2 months from now, and the numbers will look a lot different. I also think that the number of we mentioned this a little bit more, the number of total confirmed cases probably is very, very understated of the number of people who have actually contracted and processed the disease or who infected. And so, there's an estimate in China that a substantially larger number than was reported processed the disease. And I think in the US, there's probably hundreds of thousands of people who have had it or are carrying the virus right now who don't have a positive confirmed test. So I also think, there's discussion of this, on more of the right-leaning media, that some of the death statistics are affected in that when people die of this, they're usually most commonly comorbidities. So they have COPD, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and so forth. And, the question is was it the COPD that killed them, or was it the coronavirus that killed them? And probably it was the coronavirus that killed them, and they were more susceptible because they had COPD. But the more conspiracy theorists are saying, well, some of these places like Italy are just calling just about everyone who dies a coronavirus death if they tested positive. And it is, you kind of have to a certain extent, trust that professionals will be honest about the reason for death. But there's probably some deaths in those numbers where people had comorbidities that were likely going to kill them anyway at this time. So it's messy.
Yeah. So we're gearing up here for the next couple of weeks of being, again, everybody on the official side of things is saying, get ready. This is not going to be pretty. There's going to be some lives lost, and you're going to have that news be in your awareness, and it's going to be hard to kind of handle. Any closing thoughts from you on, how you've stayed? I'm sure you found ways to stay positive in this in the middle of knowing that some of this is ugly. Any thoughts for listeners in terms of maintaining kind of some inner peace and continue to kind of move forward, at least having the hope that there are better days ahead?
Yeah, I was muted. I think there are several things. The main thing is that you got to take a break. Like, you can't watch and listen to this all day. People are going to die or they're not going to die. And for most of us, there's nothing that we can do about it. It's going to happen. And so the things that help process grief with regard to a faith crisis, reaching out to people, interacting with them, employing principles from Eckhart Tolle, secular Buddhism, things like that, spending time with animals, spending time outside in the sun, listening to music, meditation, yoga, reading, exercise. All of those things are going to be helpful for people. There have been times in this that I've felt afraid. I listened to a podcast episode from the New York Times that interviewed a physician in Italy, and he shared what happened. And he shared the death all around him, and through tears shared some of his colleagues that got infected as healthcare workers who died. And it was extremely moving. And after I listened to that, I was afraid. Like, I cried after that one. That was tough. And those kinds of things are going to happen. But there's a lot of positive things also that will be born out of this. We'll use technology like we're using, we'll have more Zoom meetings. Like, I'm going to be able to participate in Thomas McConkey's Lower Lights next week because he's going to do it on Zoom. That's awesome, because I'm in Montana, so I don't get to go down and participate in that. But really, to find peace, it's going to be the similar things that we used to try to find peace and process grief through faith crisis. We're prepared for this.
Yeah, I hear you. I appreciate you being on today. So hopefully you and I are going to get together, try to get together every Sunday evening, kind of rehash what's happened in the last week. Some of them might be 20, 30 minutes long. This one, because of conference, we spend a few extra minutes there. There may be weeks where there's no tangent involving some, and we're just kind of giving an update on the COVID-19 virus. In Utah, again, a lot of Mormons are here. We've not really experienced any kind of official shutdown yet. But in a lot of places, you are at order to be in your home. So everybody be safe. Wash your hands. Use hand disinfectant where you can. But wash your hands primarily as a main way to stay clear of this, as well as protecting what you breathe in and breathe out. As Anthony spoke of earlier with the mask, whatever kind of mask you can get. Even a handkerchief helps you be better protected at sharing. If you're infected and don't know it, sharing it with others, it protects them from you at the very least to a degree. But be safe out there. Any other tips for people? Any other thoughts on things they can do just to be a little safer?
Just know that this will pass. This is temporary. We'll get through this. That's what human beings do. Seek things that inspire you and feed you. Spend time with your loved ones. Take a break if there's tension. We'll get through this.
Yeah, I love it. We're playing a lot more games at home. We just played Loaded Questions a couple hours ago.
Nice.
We've sat and played Monopoly. I haven't played Monopoly in forever. Played some Monopoly with the family. Jackbox on TV. A few video games with my son. I'm reading books. I'm listening to things, and I still work. I work at a pawn shop, and I'm working every day. But when I come home at night, we're just nowhere to go. So we're figuring out ways to have fun at home and to enjoy each other's company. Be safe, Anthony. Everybody else out there, be safe, and have a great night, guys. And Anthony, I'll see you next week.
Sounds great. Thank you very much.
Have fun, guys.
Thanks.